to the second edition of the seminar series on Sephardic thought and modernity, co-sponsored by the Schusterman Foundation, for the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Branda University, and the Billsburg Program for Israel Studies at University of Calgary, and organized by Yuval Ivry and I, Angie Cohen. It is a pleasure for us to welcome you all to this second meeting of this seminar series. So today we have with us Professor Lital Levy. But before we introduce her, I would like to say a few words about last session. In our last meeting, we welcomed Emile Al-Khalai to this virtual table and inaugurated his second edition with a dialogue about his experiences researching Jews and Arabs in the Levant. We discussed the need to come up with nonlinear models to represent history and see the connections and reverberations between time periods, modes of thought, languages, genres, etc. Al-Khalai brought to the fore George Kobler's idea that it would be much more productive to our understanding of history if, instead of taking biology as a model, we rather used the language of electrodynamics as metaphors. And thus, we spoke about generating centers, relay points, circuits. He spoke about his experiences researching Mizrahi literature and shared how his theoretical production is embedded in his own experiences in the field, conducting research with activists, witnessing a historical period and the struggle of a people, the conflicts of a country, the marginalization of communities, and abuse of power. Al-Khalai discussed the politics of translation and how certain translations never get to be published because they don't fit a certain narrative about a people, a country, or a culture. This was the starting point of this year's seminar, which we continue to conceive as an ongoing dialogue with different arguments to which all speakers and participants contribute. Before welcoming our next speaker, Professor Lital Levy, I will just remind everyone that the seminar will be structured as usual, 45 minutes of presentation and around half an hour of Q&A. Dr. Sabrina Perich will be moderating the chat, so you're all welcome to write your questions there. If someone wishes to open their microphone and ask their question, you're more than welcome to do so. Just make sure to let the moderator know on the chat and wait for your turn. We're very, very happy to have Lital Levy with us today, and Yuval Ivry will now introduce her. Thank you.
Thank you, Angie, and thank you everyone for coming. And it's a great, great pleasure to welcome Professor Lital Levy and to introduce her. And as we will see, the lecture and discussion today will be a great continuation of our discussion last time. So Lital Levy is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and a member of the program in Judaic Studies in Princeton University, where she teaches in the areas of Hebrew literature, Arabic literature, comparative literature, and theory, and Jewish studies. She specializes in contact zones of Hebrew and Arabic within literature, cultural studies, and intellectual history. She is the author of the award-winning Poetic Trespass, Writing Between Hebrew and Arabic in Israel, Palestine, published in 2014. I have to mention it's a brilliant, brilliant book that I use a lot in my class and in my research, which investigates the cultural politics of Hebrew-Arabic multilingualism and translation and how Arabic has influenced the formation of Hebrew-based Israeli culture. Her other publications include articles and books chapters on the topics of Arab Jews, Jewish literature and world literature, Jewish memories of Baghdad, and Mizrahi literary history. She is currently writing a book titled The Jewish Nahda on the intellectual history of Arab Jews from 1850 to 1950. This is a highly anticipated book by many scholars and students in the field. Professor Levy's work on the Jewish engagement and participation in the Nahda, meaning the Arab revival movement, as well as the connections between the Nahda and the Haskalah Hebrew revival movement, already transformed and expanded our understanding of the history of both movements and as well as the history of Arab Jewish intellectuals at the turn of the 20th century. In the context of our lecture today, I want to highlight one of her articles focusing on Esther Moyal, who will be in the center of our discussion today. The article titled Partitioned Pasts, Arab Jewish Intellectuals and the Case of Esther Azari Moyal, 1873 to 1948. The article or book chapter was published in 2012, and I highly recommend reading it, definitely if you will have more interest on delving on the figure of Esther Moyal. So the title of our lecture today is Esther Moyal, Emile Zola, and Alfred Dreyfus, an Arab Jewish feminist on the affair that rocked the world. So Lital, it's a great, great pleasure to have you here. I'm really, really happy that you are willing to come to our series. I think it's a great honor for us, and the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Yuval, for that really generous introduction. And it's also an honor for me to be part of this series. So thanks both to Yuval and Angie for organizing it. It's a really amazing series. I'm thrilled to be part of it. And I encourage everybody here to attend the other talks as well. I'm looking forward to all of them. Thanks also to Anna for all of the help with the logistics. So I'm going to share my screen now and just check that it is visible. Just a moment here. Okay, can everybody see the PowerPoint? Awesome. So with no further ado, let's just play from the, whoops, sorry, go back to, okay. Here we go. Right, so I'm going to start out just by contextualizing the project a little bit. So in general, I work on Middle Eastern Jews. I'm sorry, is everything okay? Okay, there is some noise. So in general, my work is on the Hebrew Haskalah movement and the Arabic Nahda. And so I want to just explain a little bit about what these movements are so that you understand how Esther Moyal fits into this kind of broader history. So the Arabic Nahda is a movement of Arabic cultural revival that emerges in Beirut in the 1830s and is then recentered in Cairo in the 1890s. And so essentially it's a response of Arab intellectuals to colonization, to European Enlightenment thought and so forth. And it's wide ranging and encompasses literature, language reform, scientific thought. Now, it's seen as the origins of Arab modernity and eventually of Arab nationalism. So it's quite consequential for the Arab world as the whole. And where we really kind of, our point of departure for this is that at the same time that this movement is transforming the kind of, intellectual sphere in the Arab world, in parallel, the Jewish world is undergoing a similar revival called the Haskalah. And that's also a response to the European Enlightenment. And in this case, it's also responding to changes in the lives of Jews around the world, beginning in Germany, but then spreading through the rest of the Jewish world. And it's similarly wide-ranging, seeking to reform Jewish life and to bring Jews into the modern world. So these two movements are taking place at the same time without much direct contact. But then there's a small group of Jewish scholars and writers in the Levant and North Africa who I'm thinking, as part of my argument, that they acted as a kind of point of connection between the two movements, sometimes writing in both Arabic and Hebrew, or sometimes writing in Judeo-Arabic. And so today's subject, Esther Moyal, is one of those writers and the sole woman among them. I'm getting a bit of feedback, so we're just going to pause and say if anybody is not muted, I would appreciate if you could mute just in case. Okay, so I would situate Esther Moyal in the Nahda, and at the same time, she's also properly situated within the first wave of Arab feminists and women writers in the Nahda. So let's talk a little bit about women writers in this period. So women participated in the Nahda in small numbers. And they were insisting on their right to have a presence in this sphere of letters. They were arguing for education, saying that women had a right to be educated and that educating women would be really necessary in order for them to be able to properly educate their own children and manage their households properly. So at this point, and we're talking about, the 1870s, 1880s, they're not arguing for equality. They're arguing for the idea that women had intellectual capabilities that needed to be nourished. Okay, so Esther Azhari Moyal is unique because, as far as we know, she's the only Jewish woman writer amongst this group of Arab women writers, right, in the Nahda period. And she wrote exclusively in Arabic, as far as we know. There was like one translation into Hebrew that appeared in a newspaper, but essentially she had a very large intellectual output and it was all in Arabic. She had a really remarkable career and was a significant woman writer in the Nahda period, but she was largely forgotten until recently, both by scholars of Arabic culture and in Jewish studies. Now, not all of her activity was centered on her Jewish identity, but her Jewishness did play an important role in her work, especially in her later work. So today, we're going to take a look at her life and times and at the multiple spheres in which she was influential, including Arab feminism and Sephardi Zionism. Okay, so Esther Azhari was born in Beirut in 1873 to a Sephardic family whose wanderings led from Spain to Istanbul to Acre, known in Hebrew as Akko. And the family resettled in Beirut in the mid-19th century, where their name was changed from Lazari to Al-Azhari. That was just kind of how people heard it. And then eventually just shortened to Azhari. The daughter of Abdallah Azhari, who was a silk scrap merchant, silk being the major industry in Lebanon at that time, Esther seems to have been something of a child prodigy. She reported that as a child, she memorized the Quran and mastered the formal rules of its recitation, and also studied the New Testament. These are really unusual achievements for a young girl at that time, let alone a Jewish girl. So when she was a young teen, she started studying at the Syrian Protestant College, and that's the school that later became known as the American University of Beirut. After receiving her degree at age 17, she taught for a few years at local girls' schools. And in those years, she also became very active in the first local Syrian women's associations and made her first forays into literary translation. In 1891, at the age of 18, she joined Bakurat Surya, the Dawn of Syria, which was one of the first Syrian women's associations. And 2 years later, she was appointed its secretary. So here you see a picture of the women's pavilion at the World Fair in Chicago in 1893. She was nominated to represent Syrian women at this exposition, along with her friend and colleague Hannah Korani from the previous slide, although it's unclear if she ever made it there. In 1896, she also co-founded another women's society, Nahdat an-Nisa, which is the Women's Awakening, also in Beirut. Now, it's in that same year, in 1893, that Esther Azhari's name began appearing in the pages of the Arabic press. One of her first publications, a translation of an Alexandre Dumas novel, was printed in installments in a journal for women. One of my favorite pieces of hers from this early period is this letter to Al-Hilal, or the Crescent Moon, an Arabic cultural journal that was like the New Yorker of its time. This is from 1894, and this is actually the first signed contribution by any woman to this journal. And by that, I mean, there were other contributions by women that were anonymous, but because it was so kind of controversial to publish as a woman during this time, she was the first woman who actually had the courage to put her name onto her letter. So here, Esther responds to a previous letter submitted on the topic of the intellect of women. And she writes, quote, "I read the serial letter included in your esteemed periodical signed by Dr. Amin Effendi Houri. I don't know how it could be that the esteemed doctor places our gender on a par with horses, donkeys, and dogs. How much more appropriate it would have been had he left the birds of his pen in the cages of nightingales, canaries, and parrots. In all truth, I'm utterly flabbergasted. I dispute his claim that the mind of women is confined within a narrow circle. Howsoever I turn my glance to the distinguished ladies who have honored me with their affection, I don't see the respected doctor's judgment applying to them. How often have I attended their meetings and heard their versatility in subjects ranging from the scientific to the religious and the philosophical? And how often have disputants competed before me, one of them belonging to the gender of the esteemed doctor, and the other one to our weak gender, that which is incapable of obtaining the doctor's regard. Proofs were exchanged, and the debaters moved from one topic to the other, and the woman was the grace of the debate, if we don't call her the winner. Furthermore, I remind the esteemed doctor that women have not entered the door of scholarship and belles-lettres until recently, due not to any shortcomings of their own, but rather because of the strong sex's disdain for them. The mocking of women by the famous French poet Moyal and others suffices as a just witness to my words and supports my claims. Okay, so as you can see, the young Esther Azhari was an outspoken advocate for women and had a bold and fiery writer's voice. While her passion for the women's cause is spelled out in unequivocal terms, it's ultimately Moyal's personality that gives life to her argument. From the imaginative invocation of her opponent's mother's versatility and skill in the household realm to the poignant description of her colleagues' intellectual versatility and adroitness in the debate room, which is a scene that she describes with so much affection, right? Moyal describes a very clear line of female aptitude. And her creative flourishes, where she opposes the horses, donkeys, and dogs that women are being compared to with the nightingales, canaries, and parrots of the writer's pen, and her elegance show us her writerly personality and her skill as an Arabic writer. And in fact, her early journalistic activity and feminist activity in these years was so remarkable that she was only in her late teens and only 20s, that two different items appeared about her in the Paris edition of the New York Herald. And so these are the two letters, and now here's a close-up. The first one on the left from March 12th, 1892, is a reprint of a letter from one S.S. Sarkis. So this S.S. Sarkis is Salim Sarkis, and he was then the editor of Lisan al-Hal, the Mouthpiece, which was a Beirut-based newspaper founded in 1877 and one of the earliest and most influential Arabic journals of the Nahda era. So here he asks the Herald to include Syrian women in their essays on the political condition of women. And Syria at that time incorporated what is now Lebanon, basically. So Moyal, even though she was in Beirut, would have been considered a Syrian woman. Now, in his letter, Sarkis highlights the contributions of Esther Azhari, she's known then, to his own newspaper, and he also mentions her literary translations. And then he followed it up a few months later with another piece from June 1892, this one titled The Emancipation of Syrian Women, in which he thanks the Herald for printing the first letter and then informs them that the censor in Beirut is, quote, too severe in treating the papers, and now prohibits anything being written by or about women in the Syrian newspapers. So he hopes that his protege, Esther Azhari, will start publishing in the leading Egyptian journal, Al-Ahram, the Pyramids. And so this is important context because it reflects two things. First is what women were really up against in trying to publish in this period. And secondly, the phenomenon of Arabic journalism at that time moving from Beirut to Egypt. Because the permissions were better, the conditions in Egypt were more permissive. There was less censorship. And so around this time, you have kind of a big relocation of some of the major writers from Beirut to Egypt. So Esther would indeed go on to publish in some of the other major Arabic newspapers and journals of the time, including Al-Ahram. And she also continued to write for Beirut-based papers, including Beirut's Arabic language Jewish newspaper, Al-Alam al-Israeli, the Israelite or Jewish World, which ran from 1921 to 1946. Now, sometime during those same years, Esther Azhari made the acquaintance of Shimon Moyal, who was a Jewish student from Jaffa, who had also become active in Nahda circles. And he was at that time studying medicine in Beirut. So Esther and Shimon were engaged in 1893. That's around the same time that she's, making her first forays into Arabic journalism. And they married in 1894, which was the year that letter in Al Hilal was published. And the newlywed couple then moved to Istanbul while Shimon was obtaining his Ottoman medical license. So he received his license in 1896, and then they had a couple of years where they were moving around a lot. They were in Safad, Tzfat in Hebrew, Tiberias in Beirut. And then finally, they resettled in Cairo in 1899, joining the large community of Syrian intellectuals and writers who had migrated there for the reasons that were mentioned in Sarkis's letter to the Herald, because there was a greater degree of intellectual freedom with less censorship. So that very same year, Esther, now a young mother, founded her own periodical, a bi-monthly journal called Al-Aila, The Family, which appeared as an Arabic women's journal through 1902, and it was briefly revived in 1904. The Family was widely circulated within Egypt and beyond. In its opening issue from May 1st, 1899, Moyal presents the journal's purpose as a conduit of communication for educated women in Egypt and Syria, writing, quote, "Because we trust that both Egypt and Syria abound with the likes of those virtuous women who achieved an ample portion of education in the sciences, general knowledge, and moral edification, and are able to support the pillars of their people and fortify the power of their countries, we announce the publication of this journal to be a link of literary camaraderie between them and a medium for carrying their individual opinions to one another. As an arena in which the horses of thought can race to reach the last word in matters related to the family and society, such as child-rearing and education, and the harmony of the household and its management." End quote. So the important thing here, as you can see, is that it's really a journal, by women for women, that's meant to act as a connecting thread between them. And then in the next section, which she titles Our Principles, meaning the principles of the journal, she puts forth three kind of feminist axioms. So the first, she says, is woman is a moral being, possessor of a free will and an active conscience. Two, she is the equal of man, and the state of her existence is subject to his direction. And three, woman has special properties not found in man, and if he is superior to her in bodily strength and willpower, then she is superior to him in the refinement of her feelings and the precision of her view. And this would be all the more so were she given the means of obtaining an education that would make her his equal in terms of taste and morals. As for the journal's content, Moyal adds that it will be divided into three parts. Quote, a literary scientific section featuring articles by Eastern writers and translations of the words of Western women intellectuals. And that is followed by, quote, a family-oriented section featuring advice on raising children with some details on handiwork and household economics with respect to food and clothing. And then that is finally going to be followed by, quote, humor and entertainment featuring the most delicious of novels, histories, and jokes, followed by announcements of public and private gatherings and festivities. So although it's a journal for women, contributing writers during the first year included a number of men, including notably including the Syrian Christian author, Nicola Haddad, as well as Esther's own husband, Shimon Moyal. Now, issues from the first year focused primarily on questions of mother-child relations, health, hygiene, nursing, and education for children of both sexes. But in addition to articles on domestic and literary topics, Moyal also printed lengthy features on world affairs. And that was atypical of women's publications at that time. So that was pretty interesting that there was a lot of, just kind of politics in it. And also, while it was aimed at a general Arab readership, this is not a Jewish newspaper, it did occasionally discuss Jewish matters. For instance, in an August 1904 edition, Moyal praises a new history of the Jewish people in Arabic written by a Christian writer, Shaheen Makarius. And then also in its review of the very first issue, another leading Arabic journal of the time called Al-Muqtataf, the Selected, notes that in an article on the topic of breastfeeding, Esther Azhari quotes Rabbi Akiva, the famous 2nd century Palestinian rabbi and legal authority considered the father of rabbinic Judaism. And Esther quotes Rabbi Akiva as saying that the mother who declines to nurse her own child, she's talking now because, upper class women would use wet nurses, right? So she's saying the mother who declines to nurse her own child is no better than a barren woman. And it's really interesting that she invokes Rabbi Akiva as a source of authority in an article that's aimed at contemporary Arab women. Now, alongside journalism, literary translation constituted another important facet of the Nahda movement, enriching the Arabic language and familiarizing readers with the story in the novel forms. And Moyal was probably the most prolific female translator of Arabic of her time, with about a dozen French novels to her credit. In one article for her newspaper called The Eastern Renaissance, Nahda al-Sharqiyya, she laments the one-sided translation practice of importing European works into Arabic, and she calls for the translation of recent Arabic writings into European languages. So here you can see the cover of her 1907 translation of Emile Zola's novel L'Argent, or Money, which in Arabic she titled El-Mal, 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 which is surprisingly idiomatic in English as it translates to money, money, money. And additionally, she translated dozens of short dramas from French to Arabic to be staged at Arab schools, in particular at the National Jewish School, which at the time was an Arabic language Jewish boarding school in Beirut. So you can see that, she had a long fascination with Emile Zola. And in fact, her most significant achievement from these years, which we're now going to discuss in depth, is her 1903 Arabic language biography of Emile Zola, the famous French writer. He lived from 1840 to 1902. Now, as far as I know, this is her only original book-length work. And it's one of, relatively few books authored by women in Arabic during this period. In the book's introduction, Moyal explains that her biography was inspired by Zola's famous defense of Alfred Dreyfus, the French Jewish army captain who was falsely accused of espionage in what came to be known as the Dreyfus affair. Later in the book, she calls Zola's intervention in the affair, quote, the most significant event in Emile Zola's life. So it was a book that was all about everything about Zola, but with a very significant investment in his defense of Dreyfus. So let's talk a bit about this event. The Dreyfus affair was a major event that rocked Europe and had profound implications for modern Jewish history, including the emergence of political Zionism. It erupted in 1894 when Alfred Dreyfus was charged with passing state secrets to Germany. Dreyfus was hastily court-martialed, convicted of high treason, stripped of his rank, publicly humiliated, and paraded before a crowd shouting anti-Semitic slurs. He was exiled for life to Devil's Island, but he maintained his innocence. And within a few years, evidence of a military cover-up began to surface, sparking massive public controversy about the state of French democracy and anti-Semitism. The case bitterly divided France. It shook France to its core and it raised a maelstrom in the European press. So it divided France into two camps, one being the progressive supporters of Dreyfus and the other being pro-army, mostly Catholic opponents, whom Moyal refers to as clericalists. On January 13th, 1898, Emile Zola famously rose to Dreyfus's defense in his open letter to the president of the French Republic, J'accuse, or I accuse, which became a turning point for public opinion on the case. In the letter, Zola directly blames the French army for its cover-up of the wrongful conviction of Dreyfus. Now, following the publication of the letter, supporters of the military sued Zola for libel, and he was brought to trial in February 1898. He was found guilty and sentenced to a year's imprisonment and a fine of 3,000 francs, but he fled the country to England. Now, as a result of Zola's open letter and all of the new attention to the case, Dreyfus did have a retrial, and he was still found guilty, but he was pardoned by the President of the Republic. Dreyfus was ultimately exonerated in 1906 and reinstated to the French army, but his case remained a notable example of French and more broadly European anti-Semitism. The Dreyfus affair gripped the public imagination of the entire world. Initially, the case didn't attract much notice in the Arab press, but toward 1896, as public doubts grew concerning France's handling of the case, it began receiving more attention. The Arabic press covered important aspects of the case, such as the military's attempts to protect Esther, who was the actual culprit, as well as the heated debates in the French parliament and the pro and anti-Dreyfus camps in the French public and press. So the coverage in the Arabic press reflected the various newspapers' political orientations and social outlets, particularly as concerned their attitude toward Jews. So, for example, reporting by the Beirut-based Catholic newspaper Al-Bashir, which was generally anti-Jewish, remained continuously hostile to Dreyfus, even after the revelations of 1897 and 1898, which led to a major shift in public opinion and to worldwide calls for a retrial. The pro-French Al-Ahram took a cautious middle line, while the pro-British newspaper Al-Muqattam, which supported Dreyfus, used the case as a platform to criticize the hypocrisy of the French Republic's claims of equality for all of its citizens. Now, a particularly noteworthy case is the famous Islamic reformer Rashid Rida's stance in support of French Jewry in his Islamic paper Al-Manar, or The Lighthouse, in which he made an explicit appeal to Arab writers to halt the tide of anti-Semitism rolling into the East from France. Ultimately, for the Arab world, as elsewhere, the Dreyfus affair became a defining moment in the development of modern journalism. This is a moment in which the newspaper emerged as a tool of critique and as an arena for exposing corruption and demanding reform. In a recent article, historian Orit Bashkin also discusses pro-Dreyfus writings in the books of Iraqi and Ottoman intellectuals and in a Ladino journal by the Salonican Sephardic journalist Sam Levy. In Bashkin's analysis, the Arab intellectuals who commented on the affair took it as a sign of the decline of France. Now, this brings us back to Esther Moyal. Turning back to Esther, her writings offer us a unique window onto the reception of the Dreyfus affair by Arab Jews who straddled both the Arab and the Jewish worlds. Her book and her commentary in her journalism are the sole surviving expressions of an Arab Jewish perspective on the affair. Moyal's biography of Zola is also very notable for what it shows us of her immense erudition in classical Arabic and in Islamic heritage. For example, in the introduction to the book, she quotes the poetry of Abu Tayyib al-Mutanabbi, the 10th century poet considered the gold standard of classical Arabic poetry. In general, like other Arabic writers of the time, good writers, Moyal writes using the cultural stock of the Arabic language and its classical heritage, quoting freely from the Quran. So let's look at some representative prose from her introduction. So she wrote, Zola has died, and his death was announced to the people the morning after they read his letter. That letter, free of doubt, was a guide to the judiciary and a light revealing truth and dispelling falsehood. Now, in Arabic, this last sentence reads, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابِ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْقُضَاءِ وَنُورٌ أَظْهَرَ الْحَقَّ فَأَزْهَقَ الْبَاطِلِ. And so that line, that book or letter free of doubt was a guide to judgment, in other words, to the judiciary or law or justice, quotes directly from Surah al-Baqarah, the cow, which is the second chapter of the Quran. And the next line, Nur, Azhar al-Haq fa-azhaq al-Batil, a light revealing truth and dispelling falsehood, alludes to another chapter of the Quran entitled Banu Israel, or Al-Isra, the children of Israel. So Esther Moyal's deployment, her free deployment of these verses from the Quran within a secular text that is about, the defense of European Jews, is an interesting kind of expression of cultural Islam. right? A way of saying, I am Jewish, but as an Arabic language writer, my literary culture is Islamic, because that's just the Arabic literary culture, right? And using this Arabic language that's so rich in Islamic references, she expresses her viewpoints about the Dreyfus affair. She's extremely critical of French anti-Semitism and the involvement of the French clergy in persecuting Dreyfus. So her writing is simultaneously very Jewish in a sense and very Islamic in another sense, right? It's Jewish in its content and interest, and it's Islamic in its language and style. Now, the rest of the biography is compiled largely from Moyal's readings in the French and English press. It covers all aspects of Zola's life and literary career, but again, devotes significant attention to the Dreyfus affair and its worldwide coverage and reception. So we'll take a deeper dive now into that part of her book. The book's 3 longest chapters are devoted to the Dreyfus affair, to J'accuse, which Moyal translates into Arabic in its entirety, and to the trial of Zola and the responses to Zola's death. Throughout these chapters, again, Moyal takes a strong position in support of Zola and against the French clerics who are supporting the military. But she was also cautious to avoid establishing any claims that she can't substantiate. Now, keep in mind that the book was published in 1903, and Dreyfus was not actually exonerated until 1906. So, for example, she writes, after this brief summation of the history of the Dreyfus and Esther cases, let us furnish the reader with our opinion on the reason for du Paty du Clam's accusation of treason against Dreyfus and for his persistent efforts, along with the other clericalist officers, to have him convicted and sentenced. However, before we explain our view of that matter, we must state that we do not seek to impose it upon the reader as the truth, because the verdict has not yet faced the true judgment of history, since most of its actors are still alive and some even still in their posts. Thus, the door remains open to conjecture and surmise. Moyal then continues, what we do say is this: it is evident that any particular faith whose members do not have judges of their own denomination in the country in which they have made their home, and have a very great interest in legitimate democratic laws prospering there. Only this will ensure that this particular community may participate in government with any true authority, since they are part of a society with the constitutional rule of law that grants its members the right to vote. So here in this section, she gets at the heart of the intrinsic association between democratic government and minority rights. And from here, Moyal then goes on to assert that the members of such a community, quote, will not give their votes to any other than those who can advance their community's fortunes and ensure the security of the position of their parliament members that support the government. This prevents them being prey to the forces of arbitrary rule and preserves a constitution that requires civil equality between all of the faiths of which the nation is constituted, without exception. This is the case with the Israelites in most of the countries of Europe. She then discusses how the Jews of France are sometimes courted by politicians when votes are in the balance, and that French Jews are thus able to ensure government stability. And she calls the French Jews the greatest supporters of the Republican principle. This, she says, is why the clericalists hate them, as they, quote, the clericalists covet an absolutist form of rule that would allow them a share in the authority of kings as the arbiters of religion. Thus, they endeavor to restore the monarchy in France, seeing the Jews as a core component of republicanism and thus despising them with a political hatred that goes beyond even their religious aversion to them. It is for this reason that the clericalists seized upon the opportunity to accuse the Jew Dreyfus of treason in order to demean the Jews in general in the eyes of the other faiths, and prove in their minds that the Republican system of government is weak, since it systematically requires that Jewish rights be preserved. So this is pretty remarkable commentary, right? And I quote these sections at length because they're representative of Moyal's lucid and penetrating understanding of the events of the time, but beyond the events, of their broader implications, not only for the future of Jews in France, but for Jewish citizens everywhere, and really for the future of democratic representative governance, right? This is all about democracy and representation and minority rights. So in this chapter, Moyal gets into some granular detail in her analysis of all of the different players in the Dreyfus affair. But from a distance, what really stands the test of time is her clear-headed identification of why this mattered so much, and her presentation of these ideas and arguments in beautiful classical Arabic for the general Arab reader. And I should note that here and throughout the book, she continues to pepper her prose with these couplets of classical Arabic poetry here and there that kind of, emphasize particular points, which is a mark of high style in Arabic at that time. Throughout the book, her voice is passionate and urgent, and she never minces words. So let's just look at one more passage. This is from 2 chapters later, where she's discussing the reaction to J'accuse. And she writes, there were no pleasantries exchanged in Paris on the day J'accuse appeared in the newspaper. A general uproar broke out, with much said and heard, and a fearful clash of opinions on the matter on all sides. It was a watershed day that no one who was in Paris at the time has ever forgotten. However, the majority of public opinion was against Zola, with most Parisians bitterly reproaching him for what he had written. They had been duped by the many claims and accusations of many of the senior army officers of that time. They had become absolutely convinced that Dreyfus was a traitor, basing their views on rumors spread by those army officers. They claimed that the retrial of Dreyfus would necessarily mean disclosing the contents of some, though not all, of the secret documents in public, and that it was the German Kaiser who was behind those deviants lobbying for Dreyfus's retrial. Also that he, the Kaiser, could save his trusty servant, Dreyfus. The air was filled with these and other allegations before Dreyfus could be summoned before the court-martial for a second time. So here, as we see, conspiracy theories have a long history, right? Absolutely nothing new there. A few paragraphs later, Moyal laments the hypocrisy and the venality of the French officers and their consorts. She writes, "It is a strange fact that among those who rebuked Zola for what he had written were people who knew the truth of the matter. People who knew the truth of the matter had studied the case's innermost details with all of the falsifications perpetrated by the army officers, and thus could only be absolutely certain in the knowledge that Dreyfus was innocent. In spite of all of this, they preferred the unjust verdict be upheld out of fear that the disgraceful acts that they knew to have been perpetrated would enter the public domain." So here and throughout the book, Moyal's voice clearly calls out the perpetrators of injustice and reflects on the courage needed to stand up to the forces of oppression and speak truth to power, which is exactly what Zola had done. After discussing Zola's tragic death by coal gas poisoning, its aftermath, and the responses in the European and Arabic presses, Moyal's book then closes with a report on establishments of memorials, monuments, and libraries in Zola's name. In a section devoted to the reaction of Jewish communities worldwide, Esther states that the Dreyfus affair, quote, was in actuality not the case of one man, but of the entire Jewish people, qadiyat al-Yahud ajma', and part of a greater struggle against clerical prejudice and injustice. This section also elicits a tangential but intriguing string of references to various European Zionist organizations and activities, indicating that Moyal was closely following developments in this area as early as the turn of the century. So for example, she writes that in a French newspaper, she read a lengthy address by someone she refers to as Zangwill, possibly meaning the British Jewish author Israel Zangwill. And this was for a ceremony marking Zola's funeral that she says was, quote, held at a sitting of the Zionist Charitable Association in Paris. She then says that, quote, many Zionists discussed the idea of establishing a permanent memorial to Zola, and that Mevaseret Zion, one of the organs of Zionism in Paris, collected a very large sum of money that was lodged in the Zionist fund in Zola's name, resulting in a letter of thanks from Zola's widow, Alexandrine. She also refers to a Zionist association in Vienna. And finally, Moyal discusses the Jews of Egypt and Palestine, saying that, quote, Israelites of Alexandria showed the love and respect that is in their hearts and held a gathering for the occasion. And she says that they discussed a means of commemorating Zola, and that, quote, I have also heard that the Israelites of Palestine have set about establishing a free public library in Zola's name, and that his works will be placed within it in all of the languages into which they have been translated. Now, all of these open references to Zionist activity are also remarkable when we think about their publication context, and that they're appearing in a book published in Cairo for a general Arab readership. Although Zionism was already beginning to be debated in the Arabic press, Moyal's approach here seems to indicate that Zionism was not yet the hot button topic it would certainly become by 10 years later in 1913. Returning to the story of the Moyal couple, not long after the Young Turk Revolution, in either 1908 or 1909, the Moyals moved back to Jaffa, where they became very active in local politics. They were loyal Ottomanists, meaning that they supported the continuation of Ottoman rule over the region. But they were also strongly in favor of Jewish settlement in Palestine. They envisioned a homeland for both Jews and Arabs within an Ottoman political framework. They were not thinking at that time about the possibility of separate independent states. They also felt strongly that the new Jewish immigrants, meaning the European Jewish immigrants, should assimilate culturally into the region. So rather than having Palestine become an outpost of Europe in the Middle East, which was Herzl's view, they really saw it as remaining, culturally in line with the rest of the Middle East. And this was a losing battle, but it's one that's important to note historically. So recent scholarship dubs their position Sephardi Zionism. This is a term that was coined by the historian Michel Campos. And this is to distinguish it from the ideas and practices of European Zionism. Now, during this time, Esther was still contributing articles to the Arabic press. And in Jaffa, she founded another women's organization, and she edited a new Arabic newspaper called Al-Akhbar, the News, and continued to write on women's issues in a variety of venues. And she gave local presentations at public events in Jaffa, including a graduation speech. This was back in Beirut. She went to deliver it for the American College for Girls in 1911. And there she speaks with clarity and vigor about challenges for women in the Arab East, and in particular about the necessity for a proper education for Arab women comparable to the education available to women in the West. Now, although the point about education is continuous from what she was advocating earlier, as we saw around the 1890s, this speech contains, I think, a stronger feminist message, because at this point in her career, she's couching the message not in terms of the needs of the family, as we saw was the trend earlier in Al-A'ila, her newspaper, but instead, she's now talking about why women need to be educated in terms of the needs of society, Arab society, nation, and the region, in rhetoric that clearly reflects the emerging Arab nationalist discourse. So you can see a clear progression from her earlier positions in the 1890s, as we saw in her letter to Al-Hilal and her newspaper, to this period. So one such lecture called Our Renaissance, Our Nahda, given in 1912 to a charitable society in Beirut, passionately decried European expansionism and expounded the path forward for Arab Nahda, or revival. In the speech, Moyal exhorted her audience to renew the greatness of Eastern Arab civilization by embracing Arab cultural traditions in tandem with modern sciences and industry. For a brief period, at the same time, Esther and Shimon Moyal and a third Sephardic writer of Arabic named Nissim Malul founded a newspaper called The Voice of Ottomanism, which was intended to defend Zionist viewpoints in the Arabic press. But it was short-lived because of the outbreak of the war, when it was shut down by the authorities. And here's another image of the masthead. Now, the First World War was a really, really terrible time in Ottoman Palestine, as elsewhere. In early 1913, Shimon Moyal had been appointed a medical officer in Ramla and Lidda, or in Hebrew Lud, and unfortunately, he died in the war in 1915. Following his untimely demise, the now widowed Esther departed for Marseille, where she seemingly drops off the radar. At the moment, there's a frustrating lack of information about her time in France, although I hope to pursue the trail and find some new information. There is one article from a Marseille-based newspaper about an anti-war protest in 1934 that mentions a Madame Moyal, the two little tiny places there that are highlighted in yellow, but I can't ascertain for certain whether this is Esther Moyal or some other Madame Moyal. Now, the next definitive sign of life that we have from Esther appears in 1936 when she is listed in a directory back in Palestine that shows her living at 3 Lilienblum Street in Tel Aviv. And this is the building today. And then in 1937, she sent a letter to Shlomo Dov Goitein, the famous Jewish historian of the Cairo Geniza, who was then based at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. In this letter, she offers to give a lecture at the university in Arabic. So the letter ended up in Goitein's archive where it was found a few years ago. So we do know that at that point, as late as 1937, she's still active, right? And she's back in Palestine and she's still trying to do something with her expertise, although it seems as though her request was not met. And then there's just nothing more after that in the archives until 7 years later in 1944, when she is visited by Yaakov Yehoshua, who is a scholar and journalist. And he's actually, interestingly, the father of the famous Israeli novelist, A.B. Yehoshua. So Yaakov Yehoshua's report, unfortunately, is bleak. He searches around, looks around, and he finally locates Moyal seemingly abandoned and forgotten. At this point, she's living alone in poverty in the slum area of Tel Aviv in Manshia. And she seems to be becoming senile as she's unable to recall the titles of the books that she had translated or, other things he asks her about his work. And so Yehoshua is disappointed. And as he writes, quote, "After I brought up some fragmented memories of her life and times, I took leave of her. And in my heart was the feeling that I had walked amongst ruins and landslides, amongst broken souls that resented me for disturbing their rest, after they had been forgotten by the dead and by the living alike." So in what may be read as an act of involuntary symbolism, Esther Azhari Moyal died in 1948, the very year of Israel's independence. And we don't yet know the reasons for this sad ending to such an accomplished life, why she was alone, why she wasn't living with any of her children. But I think we can guess at why she was forgotten for so long. By 1948, her life's project was obsolete. She had left the Arab world behind for Palestine, in a sense, right? Because the old Palestinian society, with its mix of Hebrew and Arabic cultures, had now been partitioned and so effectively destroyed. The new Jewish state had moved in a completely different direction, both culturally and politically. So it was really not until a few years ago that those of us scholars who are deeply invested in that old mixed society of early 20th century Palestine started digging into the lives of the Moyals and realized her importance. There's still much more to discover about her remarkable story, and hopefully time will fill in the gaps. And that's what we have for now. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy now to answer some questions.
Thank you, Lital, for that wonderful talk. Thank you. I would like to begin just by collecting a bunch of questions that arose during your talk. There was a lot of interest in from 5 or 6 attendees in terms of the reach and the audience of Esther Moyal's work. Can you speak a little bit about was the journal and her book, were they widely circulated? Was there a large audience? Was it translated into other languages at the time? What would have been her influence?
Right. So this is always the first question, not just for, talk about Moyal specifically, but, about Jewish writers of Arabic. And unfortunately, we do not have any data that would be able to tell us about circulation and reception per se. So all we have is kind of anecdotal evidence from what other writers had to say about these works. So, what I can say about her journal, I don't have statistics on how many copies were issued, where it circulated. We just don't have any information about that. But what we can say, again, is that, this is in a period in which journals are shared and read aloud, right? And so you can kind of safely assume that, even if like one person buys a journal, that it's reaching an audience of, for every journal that's purchased is probably reaching an audience of, who knows, like 10 people, 20 people, because they're passed around, right? And they're read aloud. Now, the circle of women specifically, her journal being written for women, it would have been small, right? In Egypt at the time, there's not that many women who are literate. They're kind of still a minority. But I think, again, it's important to understand influence in ways that are not just restricted to numbers, right? The point is that it's a discourse that's circulating, and it's not just women who are making these arguments. There are also Arab men who are advocating on behalf of women, for their educational rights and so forth. And so it's part of a larger discourse that we can see as, sort of the early Arab women's movement or feminism. Now, in terms of the book, I have an interesting story to share. So, I had first heard about Esther Moyal as she was mentioned by the late Shmuel Moreh, who was a real pioneer in terms of kind of just, recovering what had been written by Jewish writers in the Arab world. And while in his own scholarship, he didn't do a lot of close readings or analysis, he really did a lot of research into just, digging back into establishing a record. And so that was extremely helpful to me as I commenced my own research. I had to do a lot of work to find Moyal's writings. Some of this work had been done by Beth Barron in her book, by Marilyn Booth in her book, right? And these are people who, scholars who wrote about Arab women in this time, but not specifically, on the topic of Jewish writing. And so it took some time to find her work. Some of it I found completely just literally without the letter in Al Hilal, just looking through, every index of every issue of Al Hilal, hoping that she might be there. And lo and behold, she was there. And specifically with the biography of Zola, where the story is interesting is that it had been mentioned somewhere, like in passing. I mean, I can't even remember now, maybe by Moreh. But I looked and looked and looked and just could not find it in any library anywhere, not in the National Library in Israel, not in Egypt. And eventually, I made a number of trips to Cairo and was just speaking with various random booksellers and giving them just lists of books I was looking for. And I finally got lucky in 2004 or 2005. A bookseller in Cairo just turned up a really tattered copy of the book. And in fact, it's mostly intact, but the first chapter has a few pages missing. And I was fortunate to acquire this copy of the biography. And that is it. I've never found another copy anywhere else. So for all I know, I have the last copy of the book that exists. And that's what I was working from for the translation. And my intention is to eventually publish the book in English translation and digitize the Arabic original and make it available publicly. So no, I don't believe that her Arabic language biography of Zola was translated before that into any other languages. And I don't know how many readers it had, but I will say again that it was reviewed by Al-Muqtataf, which Al-Muqtataf and Al-Hilal were the two leading Arabic cultural journals of their day. And so it did definitely attract the notice of her peers, of other Arabic language intellectuals of the period.
Thank you. I want to ask a follow-up question from the chat from Shana Weiss that connects to what you've been talking about. Shana Weiss asked that she would love to hear more about your research process. What did it take to get to this project about Esther Moyal? How did you first hear about her? Can you describe a little bit about the process of tracing out her writings and letters across the world?
Oh, thank you so much for that question. Well, it's been a long process, right? So, I mean, as I said, I found the book in 2004, and that gives you some indication of how long of a process this has been. But yes, so again, just to reiterate on the following points, I believe that I first heard Moyal's name mentioned by one of the writings of Shmuel Moreh, who was an Iraqi-born Israeli scholar of Jewish writing in Arabic. He was at the Hebrew University for many years, and he passed away some years ago. And again, Esther Moyal was known or is known to other scholars of women in the Nahda, Arab women's writing from the 19th century, and had been mentioned in previous scholarship by Beth Barron, by Marilyn Booth, and maybe a handful of others. But before I began working on her, she wasn't really widely known to people working specifically on the history of Arab Jewish intellectual thought or Sephardic intellectuals, although historians, I'm primarily a scholar of comparative literature, and I kind of move between literature and history, but other scholars who are based more squarely in history who were doing similar projects around the same time, like Michelle Campos or Abigail Jacobson, who were working on this community of Sephardi intellectuals in Palestine around the turn of the 20th century. They were interested in her husband, Shimon Moyal, and in their colleague, Nissim Malul. And so, she kind of appeared like a little bit around the same time that I was starting to dig into her work in that context, and in more in terms of what she was doing in Palestine after 1908, briefly. But I was just super interested in her because, first of all, she's amazing, right? Like, this is a woman who is so ahead of her time, so brilliant, so remarkable, so accomplished. And you just don't understand how she even did all of this, given that she had no support, given that she had children, right? She was so prolific. It really is mind-blowing. And it took some time, to dig in. So like I said, some of it was literally, at the time I was doing this research in the early 2000s, things were not digitized. So some of it was literally just going to libraries and archives and just patiently, flipping through lots and lots and lots of stuff, just hoping to find something. In other cases, I had a few tips based on what people had found before me, and they were kind enough to share material with me. And, some of it was just kind of ongoing. So it was just, that kind of work takes time, and it's a project that I've been going back to over time. So Yuval was kind enough to mention the chapter that I had published about Esther, from which some of the material in this talk was drawn. And I'd be happy towards the end to post a link to that in the chat. But that was sort of the first phase of my research on Moyal. And then recently, I've just had the opportunity to go back and work more closely on the Zola biography, which is something that I've been wanting to do for a long time with some research assistance. And the last frontier is to try to figure out what happened to her in France, which is proving to be really challenging. So I have a research assistant now helping me in France, and even being located there, she's having a hard time coming up with anything. It's like Moyal just completely disappears. So I'm hoping that over time we'll find more material, but it is definitely kind of an ongoing process, and to some degree, collective. And I want to, thank some of the people who have helped me along the way. So for instance, that letter to Goitein was located by Hanan Harif in Israel when he was doing research into the Goitein archive. He just found it a few years ago. And Noam Sienna, who is with us, I think, in the audience, found the two letters by Salim Sarkis and shared those with me. And so also, I know Yuval has been doing some research on her, and, I think we're lucky to have each other as a scholarly community and to share our resources, because we really do need to make this a collective effort.
I'm going to switch a little bit back and forth between live questions and chat now. So what I'd like to do is start, we have two hands raised. If I can just ask both of the audience members to unmute yourself, and please give both of your questions in turn, and maybe we can take them together, and then we'll take some from the chat together as well. So I'd like to start off with Stephen Gertzoff. If you are speaking, you are still muted. Okay, we will take a question from Louis Fishman, please.
Yeah, Louis, please.
Louis.
Yeah, Louis Fishman, thanks so much. Yeah, thanks for a fascinating talk. Every time I read about Esther Moyal, I'm I'm so amazed by her. Oh, can you hear me? Okay, yeah, by her and by your work also. This question of Sephardic Zionism and Esther Moyal has always really got me. I mean, the voice of Ottoman newspaper. My understanding of it is that it wasn't able to really make waves in Palestine or even take hold because of that divide between the Palestinians actually not accepting that Sephardic type of Zionism, which was in some sense very similar to the Ashkenazi Zionism, where the Ashkenazi Jews were joining the army and becoming Ottomans, and they had this interplay between the communities. So what was it that marginalized both her and Shimon in Palestine? Because in the Palestinian press, they're actually mocking Shimon Moyal and they mock Nisa.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, and I love how you pointed out about Egypt, right? How they're able to make waves in Egypt, but when they come to Palestine, everything changes. So how have you found any way to sort of understand her role there?
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is, when I'm thinking about this, it's almost that she's sidelined in her lifetime a bit by Shimon Moyal. I don't want to put that too much on it, but she seems much more prolific than Shimon was, and maybe even much more popular in that sense. And do you see a tension there at all? She has no diary, so it'd be very hard to do. But that the idea of Shimon, when he comes to Palestine, he really takes the #1 role, and she seems secondary almost to him, at least in Palestine.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. I mean, I think that to address the first part of your question about how she and other Sephardi intellectuals writing in Arabic were kind of marginalized, you know, Abigail Jacobson and Moshe Naor's book does a great job of addressing that. And so, I mean, the answers are already there, you know, and we know about this letter from Yaakov, I think, Rabinowitz in like 1913 or something with, you know, debating, talking about Yaakov Sanua, the famous Jewish Egyptian author, and about this debate with, you know, the sort of Moyal and Malul faction about whether Arabic should be, you know, widely taught to Jews in Palestine. And his position in the language wars, where he really sort of like mocks their position on Arabic. And so this, yes, like you're absolutely right that even in this period after the Young Turk Revolution and before the First World War, even when they, you know, seem to have some influence, they're already being kind of sidelined and marginalized by the Ashkenazi Zionists because they just don't share their viewpoint, right? And, you know, there's this group of, I mean, these are people that Yuval writes about as well, like the group of native Sephardi Palestinian intellectuals who really like want to see themselves as having some importance because they can be a bridge, because they're mediators. They see themselves as being mediators between the Ashkenazi Zionist project and the Palestinian population. But ultimately, you know, by like the mid-1920s, they're completely irrelevant. Like they are completely kicked out, so to speak, of the project, and they lose whatever influence they had, even though previously, you know, they tried to like be translators and kind of position themselves in that sense. So, you know, again, if you want to understand the political dynamics of it, Jacobson and Naor have done a really great job, I think, of writing about that. And then
they're also marginalized in the Iton HaChirut also. That's what my sort of my argument. They're greatly marginalized by the Sephardic community also, that is arguing that not enough people read Arabic to make this paper successful. So what about that side? That marginalized by their own.
Yes. So I don't want to get too much into the weeds here because I know there are other questions. So I'll just address the other part of your question about, you know, sort of Shimon like overshadowing her. So I think, you know, we could see Moyal's life and work in different phases. And I think certainly in the Cairo phase, she's not being overshadowed, right? And, you know, some of her work is in Arabic feminism, some of it is in literary translation. And in those realms, really, like she's not, you know, her husband is not participating in those activities and she has her own standing. I do agree with you that after they come to Palestine, you know, he's certainly more of a prominent figure than she is. And that's, again, for reasons that, you know, other scholars have addressed. But, you know, that doesn't, I think, kind of cast a shadow over her entire career, because certainly in the first part of her career, she really made a name for herself and was widely known in those circles, right? And, you know, Cairo 1890s is a different world culturally and politically than Palestine in the 1910s. So you kind of, I think, need to see it in separate phases.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a couple of very specific questions from Ala Murad in the chat, who thanks you for the wonderful talk. And they are looking forward to your forthcoming book. So a couple of quick specific questions. Did Azhari write about or publicly engage with Arabic literature, classical or modern, or Arabic novels and writers, as opposed to European works in translation? Zainab Fawaz had a similar response in Al-Mu'ayyid to men like Amin Khoury. Yes. Do we know to what extent the intellectual contributions of women like Azhari were socially organized into action? And lastly, was Azhari tutored? Do you know who her tutors are? She writes, I'm curious about her access to advanced Islamic learning, specifically how she would have been instructed in Quranic sciences, or was she self-taught?
Yes, so the second part of the question I addressed in the talk, but I know there's like, it goes by really quickly. So just to review that part, yes, she was instructed. So she was kind of a child prodigy, and she started studying, I think, around age 11 with a kind of notable Arab instructor. I'm trying to remember his name. I mentioned it earlier. I think it's Mohammed al-Bakr or Mohammed Bakri, but it's earlier in the talk. And then she attended the school that later became the American University of Beirut, before it was called that, and graduated around the time of 18. So she had formal instruction, and as part of her training, she did memorize the Quran, which was extremely unusual for you know, a Jewish girl at that time. So I mean, that is what we know. There's not a huge amount of information on her. All of that is drawn from one source, which we hope is accurate. I mean, there's just really no way to verify any of it. Right. But if anyone is interested, again, this is all in the chapter that I had published on her earlier, that I'll try to, you know, before we disconnect the Zoom at the end, I can put a link to that into the chat. And that is in a collection that is edited by Diala Hamza on the Arab intellectual. So yes, she did have this formal training, and yes, absolutely. She was definitely part of a circle of Arab women in the Nahda, and that was why I had that slide of Hana Qurani, her contemporary, and she was very much engaged with Hind Naufal, who was another Arab woman in the Nahda. So there's a circle, yes, there's Zainab Fawaz, Hind Naufal, Aisha Taimur. So Naufal mentions Esther Azhari as you know, having been nominated to, this is in her journal, this is in Naufal's journal. So she mentions that Esther Azhari, you know, received a letter inviting her to represent Syrian women at the Colombian World Expo. And then we have no information on why she doesn't go. I'm pretty sure she never actually went, even though some sources say that she did, because there's no record of her in the records of the Women's Pavilion at the World Columbian Expo, but Hana Qurani was there representing Syrian women. So all of this is kind of a roundabout way of saying that she was directly part of those circles. She was involved in the literary salons and the women's societies. She was the secretary of one of the women's societies, and she founded her own society as well for Arab women in that period. And so she was directly involved in that small group of women in the Nahda who were, you know, part of a cohort. And that did frame her work, absolutely.
There's a couple of questions too from Marjorie Kravitz about her family life. So what education did Esther Azhari give her children? Did she have children? Is there possibilities of tracing her through them? And are there any photos or other documents about her?
Yes, so the photo is a sore point. I would love a photo of her. There are various photos floating around on the internet that claim to be of Esther Moyal, but one has to take into account that this is a common name, right? Moyal is a common North African Jewish name. Esther is a common, you know, Jewish first name for women. And there's absolutely no way to substantiate with any of those photos, you know, which Esther Moyal we're talking about. And so no, unfortunately, I do not have any photos, you know, to speak of that I know are her. And in fact, all of those other later Esther Moyal photos started appearing after I published my chapter. So we do have a photo of Shimon Moyal that was in the PowerPoint presentation. And then as for her children, her eldest son also became a writer. right? And this is another interesting story. So his name is either Ovadia in Hebrew or Abdallah in Arabic, Abdallah Nadim. In any case, he goes by Nadim, his middle name. But the reason it's interesting is that he's named after another famous Arab intellectual in Egypt who is a friend of Esther and Shimon. And that's the Abdallah part of his name, and who had been exiled in Istanbul at the same time that they were there. And so, it's notable that he takes on this name. But in any case, he himself becomes a writer and is kind of like about the age of being a university student in Beirut when they are putting together the short-lived newspaper, The Voice of Ottomanism. And he even contributed an article, I think, to like the first or second issue of the newspaper. Now, again, I don't know what happens to Esther in the period in which she is in Marseille. Supposedly, she emigrated there with 2 of her daughters. She did have a few other children, at least 2 daughters. I just don't have any. I mean, that was, again, something that I think it was in the Yaakov Yoshua article, he said that. And I have substantiated that she had daughters, but I haven't been able to find, records of them entering Marseille or anything like that. Her son in the 1920s published some poetry collections in Hebrew, Arabic, and French. So he was still active. It seemed as though he was based in Palestine or moving between Palestine and Beirut. He does not seem to have been in France with his mother and sisters. And I think the last record of him, and again, this is in the chapter that I published, was from the 1930s. And then he also kind of drops off, out of the record. And I don't know what happened to him later. And I also don't know why he wasn't taking care of his elderly mother, unfortunately, when she was discovered kind of alone and, not doing well in 1944.
Great, thanks. There are a number of comments and requests from the chat to have some references to the sources that you cite. So perhaps we'll gather some of those requests and send those to you after the talk. Louis Fishman adds, thanks for the answer. I might add my question of marginalization was directed by Palestinians and even by Sephardic Jewish communities in Palestine, as seen in Hayahut. Thus, I was not talking about marginalization by Ashkenazim, which is, as you state, has been done. And there's, I'll turn to a question to Stephen Gertzhoff and then another question from the chat.
My observation about, I presume I'm unmuted now? Oh, great. I'm an interventional radiologist. Lately, I've become an interventional historian, and I found absolutely fascinating the hanif, the natural nature of Esther Moyal's feminine bent, that she was writing in a way that I don't see in modern feminists now. It was pure. My comment was about the need for Emile Zola. Where are you now that we need you most today? Because so many of the parallels of his defense of Dreyfus speak forward today about the problems Israel is under attack from Amnesty International, for example. I don't want to politicize this, but I can't help but see the parallelism and think that maybe some junior academic might want to write in the voice of Emile Zola's grandson about what's going on today. And I thank you for your work on this. Absolutely fascinating.
Okay, thank you for the comment.
There's a question in the chat asking, to what extent did Esther Moyal engage with modern Hebrew literature? Did she have contact with Ashkenazi intellectuals, female Ashkenazi intellectuals specifically after moving to Jaffa?
That's a really great question. And unfortunately, it's a question that I do not know the answer to. I don't believe she had much contact. I mean, at least there's not, I mean, maybe she did, but there's not really evidence that she had such contact. Her world really did seem to be kind of an Arabic language, cultural world. The one thing I can say is that there is one letter by her to Hatzvi, the Hebrew language newspaper from, it's maybe 1910 or 1911. And it probably, I'm guessing, was translated into Hebrew. I don't believe she had the facility to write in Hebrew herself, but I'm just not 100% sure about that because I just don't have, sort of the data either way. So my guess would be that she either didn't have much contact, or if she did, it would have been maybe sporadic, but not sort of central to her identity as a writer.
That wraps up the questions from the chat. I'd like to ask one. I'd like to take it. I'm going to take a moderator's prerogative and ask a question. And I wanted to ask you if you could speak a little bit to whether Esther Moyal's appearance could be thought about kind of more broadly. Is she representative, or does she connect? There seems to be at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, a broad move in sort of Ottoman peripheries for women and Jewish women writers to appear and write in local languages. Is there something that Esther Moyal contributes to our understanding of Jewish women at the end of the Ottoman Empire in general?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I mean, I'm trying to think about, I mean, she's quite unique as a Jewish writer of Arabic, right, at that point. Now, of course, you know, getting into Iraq in the interwar period and into the 1940s, you have other Jewish women who are writing in Arabic. In Egypt, there are certainly Jewish women who are, you know, reading Arabic, who are involved in things. There aren't, you know, at her moment, I really can't think of anybody else who's doing the kind of work that she's doing in the Arabic language Ottoman world. Now, getting into the Ladino speaking parts of the Ottoman Jewish world, I'm not an expert in that arena, and off the top of my head, I also can't think of a woman writer, but I might be wrong about that. And it's something that I'd have to look into more and, you know, maybe circle back later. I do know that there are women writing in Ladino later in the 20th century, but like after the, you know, dissolution of the Ottoman Empire altogether, which was sort of the final blow, was like 1922, but it's something that's already, you know, underway at the end of the First World War. So, you know, it's a great question. And honestly, Sabrina, it's one that I'd have to do more research on. I mean, Yuval, do you have something to add to that?
No, I'm just saying, I think first of all, definitely the question of who is writing Arabic in different kind of languages. But I think that what you brought in this kind of lecture, and you know, you're talking about partition past, and I'm really, you know, I think that there's the story with mentioning Rabbi Akiva in one hand, and then mentioning, you know, verses from the Islam in the other hand on the same kind of subjects. I think this is kind of a troglossic position of, you know, multiple languages, and you wrote about it, and multilingual position. This is maybe the one that is more interesting for us to see. And I'm curious, you know, how can, you know, part of the partition past is the partition disciplinary views that we have. So we have either Arabic literature or Hebrew literature, either Jewish literature or, you know, Arabic literature, and she doesn't really fit in none of that, or as, you know, Louis is bringing the Zionist or not Zionist again, this kind, I think it's kind of partitioned way that we already looking at her from this kind of categories that already been partitioned, and she doesn't really fit. So I'm really wonder how you going around that in your work on her, you know, her journey.
Yeah, no, that's, it's, what can I say? That is, it's not even just an important question. It's really kind of, I mean, the frames that we work in are everything, right? You know, and it's, so I think, you know, Yuval, the thing is, the whole reason really that I got into this project to begin with was because of my unhappiness with the frames, so to speak, the scholarly frames, and realizing that not just Esther Moyal, but the Jewish writers of Arabic didn't fit, and they weren't in the histories, right? They were just absent. There was a real absence at the time. And I'm going back to, you know, when I started studying the history of Hebrew literature and the history of Arabic literature, or the history of, you know, sort of Jewish modernity more broadly and Arab modernity back in the 1990s when I was in college. And of course, we were lucky enough to have Emile Al-Kalai, you know, in the last presentation in the workshop, and his book, After Jews and Arabs, was so influential for me. He published that in 1993. And I mean, there's so much in that book. At the same time, you know, he did so much there, but it's the span of that book is so huge. It's not specifically an intellectual history or a literary history about, you know, this particular century that I'm talking about, 1850 to 1950, which the importance of that century is really the sort of span from the Nahda and the Haskalah through the creation of Israel, and everything changes, right? And it's like that century is, you know, in a nutshell, Arab Jewish modernity, or more broadly, Middle Eastern, North African, Sephardi, you know, modernity. And so really it was my realization that these frames that we have are not sufficient for understanding this experience and don't explain this experience that sent me on this journey, right? Yeah. And so I agree with you 100%. And I think that maybe, you know, rather than trying to fit these writers into those frames that don't work, the whole point of this type of scholarship is to redo the framing from the inside out, to let the material itself, you know, give us new frames of discussion, new frames for understanding the broader phenomenon and the types of interactions, right? And so I agree with you completely. Like we can't, you know, just say like, well, you know, these writers are Hebrew writers or Jewish writers or Arab writers. They themselves, their identities didn't fit into those boxes and their work didn't fit into those boxes. And so we need to get rid of the boxes. So basically, I'm just kind of reiterating your question to say that I agree with it, but the research itself is the way that we undo those frames.
Yeah, definitely. I will just add that I see that that also Angie have, but I just will say quickly that your work, you know, you also going and tracing the 1950s Arab Jewish writers coming to Israel and moving from Arabic and Hebrew. And some of time, you know, most of the research will do like they're moving from one, you know, planet to another planet, doesn't have any connection. And going back to this kind of 19th century options shows that it's not really a different kind of planets. It's something that have already been in connection and intersections.
Yes, and yeah, you know, definitely. And, you know, going back to Angie's point about sort of a different kind of literary history that's not all invested in like very neat linear continuity. I mean, I definitely agree with that because in some sense, the interesting thing, and I talk about this in another article that I published in Proof Text years ago called Reorienting Hebrew Literary History. I had been fortunate enough to interview both Sami Michael and Shimon Balas before Shimon Balas passed. And I asked them, like, did you know about these Jewish writers of Arabic in the Nahda? Like, did you know about Yaqub Sanua, who's, you know, pretty famous in the Arab world? I mean, I knew they wouldn't know about Moyal because nobody knew about her, but like, did they know about any of it? And the interesting thing is they didn't, you know? And I mean, Sami was very upfront with me and said, you know, his influences were world literature, European languages, which he read in Arabic.
But not as a kid, you mean? Yeah, but later on, Shimon Balas wrote a novel based on.
Oh yes, later on, Balas wrote a whole novel about Sanua. Okay. But I'm talking about their formation as writers in Iraq. And so it's not that there's a direct line where you can say, okay, we have Yaqub Sanua, you know, writing in the 19th century, and we have Moyal writing in like 1910, and then we get to, no, that's not the story. But I think that you can think about it more generally in terms of how the Jewish writers are participating in the discourses of their time and place. And those discourses do actually have continuity because it is the discourse of the Nahda more generally that, you know, sort of feeds the Nahda in Iraq a little bit later, right? The Nahda in Iraq really gets underway more in the 1920s. And then from the outset, you have Jewish writers participating in that, even if they themselves are not aware of the history of their, you know, Jewish predecessors in Beirut and in Iraq. And so if you look at it kind of more broadly, I think that there is actually a kind of thread. There is some continuity. It's just that it's not as sort of neat as saying that, like, you know, each Jewish writer leads to another Jewish writer specifically, because again, they're writing for, in the most of the time, they're writing for Arab audiences more generally, not just for Jewish readers, right? So it's a way of kind of saying that broadly, like I do agree with you, Angie, but at the same time, there is some aspect of continuity if you're looking at it more in terms of, you know, kind of broader contributions, right? And the phenomenon, and that there's continuity from the 19th century Nahda to the projects in places like Iraq and Egypt, the literary projects of the 20th century.
Oh, yeah, I guess so one of the topics of, well, first of all, thank you for a fantastic talk. And so in answer to your comment, which was actually connected to the comment that I wanted to make, so when we thought about this series on continuity and rupture, we were also thinking in terms of legitimacy, both in academic terms and in cultural terms. So to me, the question is not so much whether there is or there isn't continuity, but whether the representation of time and culture includes which continuities are legitimate and which continuities are not, which connections among fields, among people, among languages are readable and understandable because they are legitimate, because they have let's say a winning political agenda behind, and which ones are not, no matter how clear they are and no matter how obvious they are historically. The fact that people could be, as he said, could have an Arabic literary culture, but write in Jewish about Jewish content. This, which shouldn't surprise us in historical terms.
Yes, but it's surprising to people. Yeah.
And it's always in this box of something curious or something surprise. So, and this is what I wanted to, I don't know, mention the question: how do we leave this space of this is so interesting, or this is so, and actually change the framework.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I mean, I think that at this point, to me, it's not interesting or surprising anymore, but I have to recognize that it is still interesting and surprising and strange to, most of the public. And it's not that surprising to me, because by this point, I've been immersed in this kind of thing for, 2 decades, but it actually was surprising to me when I first encountered it, because we were all conditioned to think that, we were all conditioned to think that Jewish writers did Jewish things and Arab writers did Arab things, and that, Arab writers use Islamic references, and why would a Jewish writer use an Islamic reference? And it's only when you spend enough time with these people, so to speak, immersed in their writing and beginning to really understand the world through their eyes, that you understand that, these types of ideas that we have about cultural identity and property and, sort of the lines of belongings that are drawn in the sand, that these are recent ideas that have nothing to do with how they were experiencing the world or how they saw the world when they were writing. And it takes an effort to, kind of let go of our notions and re-educate ourselves. And again, this is a collective effort that, not just me, that I'm lucky enough to have wonderful colleagues who are taking part in this along with me. And I don't know how long it will take to sort of, percolate back into kind of mainstream opinion, but the media is generally not doing us any favors, because media discourse tends to just kind of reiterate over and over that there are these lines of separation and enmity, and kind of make it sound as though these are historical and they've been around forever, and it's not the case. But hopefully at some point the scholarship will have enough of an impact that it will begin to change the public discourse. I don't know when that will be. I hope it will happen.
Thank you. And I know there are more questions, but we are we're 2 minutes over the time, and we do try to be respectful of everybody's time and of our own commitments. So thank you very, very much, Lital, for this fantastic talk. And I just want to remind everybody that our next meeting is on March 9th. And we will be welcoming Deborah Starr and Eyal Sagui-Bizawe with a conversation that they've called Nostalgia as Critique, the Case of Jews in Egyptian Cinema. It will be, as I said, a conversation between the two of them. And we hope to see you all there. You're welcome to send more questions. We will make sure to send them to Lital, so she can get back to you. And thank you very much.